What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So this is a video in response to Jimmy Smith's recent video that he posted about Dustin Poirier and about Poirier's legacy, about whether he's an all-time great, whether he's an all-time great lightweight. And I'm making this video because I do ultimately disagree pretty strongly with Smith's take. I think he's pretty massively underrating Poirier and what he's done. But there is some nuance to it. There are reasons to be a little critical of Poirier's overall resume and the wins he has. And Smith does bring up some pertinent questions that we would want to consider when evaluating a guy like Poirier. So I just wanted to get into it and kind of give a counter, but also, add some layers of analysis to the whole thing. Now, this isn't, a jab at Smith. This isn't like an effort to start internet beef. This isn't me saying Smith is an idiot, that he doesn't know what he's talking about, because I really like Jimmy Smith. I've been a fan of his for a while. He first came on my radar when I saw him in the Fight Quest TV show. There's actually a scene from that show that kind of lives like rent-free in my head, and it's from the episode where they go to France. They're learning savate, which is the French kickboxing art, and Smith gets partnered up with this coach who used to be a professional fighter, was like a savate world champion or something, and this guy's like a real hard ass. He's a real nail driver. He's putting Smith through the ringer. He's putting him through these Rocky-esque workouts that are very intense. And there's this moment where Smith is so beat up and so tired that he's having a difficult time obeying the instructions that the coach is giving him. And in between rounds, the coach walks up to him and he just goes, "Where is the respect for instruction, Mr. Jimmy?" And, and I just thought that was really funny and endearing. And I think of that moment when I'm training and when my coach is yelling at me and I'm like not doing what he's telling me. So I think about that often. And so I like that show. I respect the fact that Smith was a professional fighter. He's a jiu-jitsu coach. I really like his commentary. I really liked when the UFC brought him on. I thought he did great work. I was really disappointed when the UFC got rid of him. And I like his YouTube channel. I'm a subscriber. I like his videos. I really enjoyed that Bryce Mitchell video he did. But I do disagree pretty strongly with this take on Dustin Poirier. So to get into it, Smith's argument kind of largely breaks down to two main schools of thought. One was the argument that Poirier never became the champion, never the undisputed champion, never the guy, the man in the division. And then another argument was that he is skeptical of how well Poirier would do if you put him back in the previous eras. So basically, he's preemptively countering an objection someone might have, which is that, well, hey, Poirier just had the bad luck of being in an era with multiple all-time great lightweights, an era where Khabib was champ, where Oliveira was champ, where Islam was champ. If you put Poirier somewhere else, he'd clean house. That would be the objection, and Smith preemptively counters that by saying, well, I'm not so sure. And so I'm going to break it down, item by item. But before we get too far into the weeds with that, I think we just need to realize that there are fighters that we basically all recognize as greats of their divisions, despite the fact they never won belts. So there's two main examples that come to mind. The first one is Mirko Cro Cop. Okay, most people consider him a great at heavyweight. He's not number one. No one thinks he's vying for the number one spot. The number one spot clearly goes to Fedor. If you disagree, just go watch my GOAT list video. Fedor is ranked at number 10. Go watch that section. Listen to me rant about why it's him and not Stipe. I'm not going to rehash that all here. But that's my opinion. But other people would have, Fedor jockeying for the number one spot. They would have Kane jockeying for it. They would have Stipe jockeying for it. Maybe you would have Ngannou jockeying for it. Some people think so. But those guys are contending for the number one spot. And then below that, you have people like Junior Dos Santos. You have people like Nogueira. You have people like Josh Barnett, maybe. You have people like Fabricio Verdum. You have these kind of guys. And Cro Cop is in that mix. He's somewhere in there. Where you would rank him is up to you, but he's somewhere in there. And Cro Cop never won a title. He never won the undisputed title. He never won it in Pride. He never won it in the UFC. However, that shouldn't diminish what he actually accomplished. If you just look at how good he was and you look at the quality of wins he has, he is one of the great heavyweights. And my memory, because I remember when he fought Fedor. I've been watching the sport quite a while, and my memory of that time, that leading up to and then after that fight, my memory is that most people kind of viewed Cro Cop as number 2 behind Fedor and Nogueira as number 3. Even though Nogueira maybe had the stronger resume, he was the Pride champion and Cro Cop never was. He actually had the win over Cro Cop, which Cro Cop never got the chance to avenge. However, that win was against a pre-prime Cro Cop who hadn't yet really learned his grappling game, and he still beat up Nogueira. He ultimately got submitted in the end, but he was kicking his ass leading up to then. And most of us thought, having seen Cro Cop's takedown defense and grappling defense improve, having seen him beat Josh Barnett 3 times, even though, while Barnett went 1-1 in neck-and-neck fights with Nogueira, like most of us thought, if Cro Cop rematched Nogueira, it would just be the first fight, but he never gets submitted, and he just beats Nogueira even worse. Most of us thought that. And to drive the point home, let's just look at people who were champions, whom none of us would rank ahead of Cro Cop as all-time great heavyweights. Look at Tim Sylvia. Tim Sylvia was, I believe, a 2-time champion because he lost it to Mir, and he won it back against Arlovsky. And no one is going to have Tim Sylvia ahead of Cro Cop. Likewise, look at Kevin Randleman. Kevin Randleman was a UFC champion. He arguably should have won the defense against Bas Rutten, and he beat Cro Cop once. Now, Cro Cop beat him in return, and they both finished each other. But Randleman was a guy who, while looking very good, while having this insane athleticism, while having some good wins and some good performances, he never really reached his potential. And if you were to look at his resume at heavyweight, just no one is going to think it's better than Cro Cop's. Everyone is going to put Cro Cop ahead of him. So there's some proof of concept at heavyweight. But we can also look at Poirier's division, lightweight. Tony Ferguson also never won the undisputed belt. He was an interim champ, just like Poirier was an interim champ. Ferguson won his interim belt against Kevin Lee, and Poirier won his against Max Holloway. And while really no one would argue that Ferguson is the top lightweight of all time, maybe there's some standout, Ferguson fans who still think prime Ferguson was going to beat Khabib or what have you. Maybe a few people like that exist, but on the whole, like no one's seriously going to put Ferguson at number 1. However, it would be insane not to have Ferguson somewhere in the discussion of lightweight GOATs. It just would. And to kind of drive that point home, just consider how insane it would sound to say that Jens Pulver is a better lightweight, a better great of the lightweight division than is Tony Ferguson. Just because Jens Pulver won the belt once, won it off BJ Penn, lost it in the rematch, but won it nevertheless. But does that make Pulver a better lightweight all time than Ferguson? Of course not. So the fact that Poirier never won the belt, to me, it's notable, and it keeps him out of certain stratas, but it doesn't in any way, in my mind, disqualify him from being considered one of the GOATs in the division. Now, the argument that he wouldn't necessarily clean house in the older eras is, I think, pretty weak. So Smith says the only lightweight from BJ Penn to Khabib that he would pick Poirier to beat would be Frankie Edgar. Everyone else he viewed either, and it was almost entirely because Frankie was small, which is true. Frankie eventually fought at bantamweight. Poirier would be the much bigger man in that fight. I think that's fair to pick Poirier, even though I love Frankie. But Smith was saying that he would pick prime BJ over him. He would pick lightweight McGregor over him. He would pick, and then everyone else, RDA, Alvarez, Pettis, Henderson, he seemed kind of like he viewed those more as like toss-ups. But to me, I think that might be some bias towards the old fighters, because don't get me wrong, I love BJ Penn. If you watch my GOAT list video, he was on my GOAT list. I argued for why people are underrating him right now, and I argued why, despite the fact that BJ Penn, had that losing streak at the end, despite the fact he's going through all these personal problems, despite the fact we watched him get knocked out cold by a drunkard in the fucking parking lot of a bar, despite all that, he is still one of the GOATs in the discussion of great fighters and one of the GOATs at lightweight. He was very good for the time. However, I'll tell you this. I happened to rewatch over the weekend, by coincidence, I happened to rewatch Penn versus Diego Sanchez, and that guy is not beating Prime Poirier. I just hate to break it to everybody, but like, the game has evolved. It has moved past where BJ Penn was. You know, that doesn't happen all the time in every division. You know, not all divisions advance at the same rate. You could take a prime Junior Dos Santos and throw him into the current heavyweight division, and maybe he would lose to Tom, maybe he wouldn't, but generally speaking, he would clean house on almost every ranked heavyweight. Junior Dos Santos in his prime would just fuck them up, because the division hasn't so eclipsed where he was the way that lightweight has BJ Penn. Because lightweight is a division that is consistently like the bleeding edge division. You know, it's the division that it's always like at, you know, representing the best of the contemporary sport at the time. And, you know, I'm telling you, like, you know, people praised BJ Penn's boxing back in the day, and it was very good for the time, and you can see he was skilled and he could crack. But I'm telling you, if you look at his power, if you look at his defense, if you look at his combination punching, if you look at his pace, it's not beating Poirier. You know, you take the Poirier that beat Holloway, throw him in there with the Penn that fought Sanchez, it's not happening. Like, the boxing is going to be Poirier's all fucking day. You'd probably knock him out. And grappling-wise, Penn was a great jiu-jitsu fighter, great takedown defense and everything, but, like, I don't see him just washing Poirier with that. I don't see him either winning a decision by just smothering him with grappling. I don't see him pounding him out. I don't see him eventually getting the rear naked choke. I could see him getting a takedown here and there like Alvarez did against Poirier, but I don't see the grappling working for him the way it did for, say, Khabib or Oliveira. And again, on the feet, Penn would not hang with Poirier. And to another example of how Penn was from an older time, like, he lands a kick on Sanchez. It's either a leg kick or a body kick. I can't remember. And Rogan goes, "Oh, a kick from BJ Penn. You never see that." And, you know, that shows, like, this was a well-rounded fighter for the time, a guy who never threw kicks. You know? And sure, we just saw Poirier fight Oliveira, and some reporters and interviewers were making a fuss over the fact that the statistic that Poirier had never thrown a body kick or a head kick in his UFC career. And yeah, that's notable. But the leg kicks are a big part of Poirier's game. Like, even someone like him, who is a bit of a specialist, or at least fights like one, you know, his skill set is extremely well-rounded, but he fights like, you know, a puncher. Even he was showing a much more well-rounded striking game than BJ Penn was. So, I really can't get behind that take at all. Now, going on, like, yes, I would also pick Poirier to beat Edgar. Benson Henderson, I like Benson a lot. I think he's very underrated. Yes, he's big, he's durable, he's scrappy, he's competitive, you know, he's got an unbreakable will, he's got a funky style, he's got great cardio. But again, I see Poirier beating him. I see that going similarly to the RDA Benson fight, if I'm being honest. You know, Prime Pettis, you know, dangerous guy, but I see Poirier putting the pace on him, not unlike RDA did. I see RDA getting knocked out by Poirier probably because I don't see him leveraging the grappling to win a decision or anything. And in the pocket, you know, trading blows, Poirier's going to get the better of it. He's going to land the counters. He's going to do more damage. You know, I don't. You know, I even like Poirier's chances against Prime Tony, and I love Prime Tony. Prime Tony is one of my favorite fighters. But I think Tony had vulnerabilities in the pocket that Poirier would take advantage of. So, and, you know, Tony wasn't a champion, but I'm just making a point here. But, and even Prime McGregor, like, because Smith seemed to dismiss the idea that Poirier could take on Prime McGregor because just like what McGregor did to him at featherweight, Smith said it would go the same way, kind of implying that featherweight Poirier was also Prime Poirier, when it simply wasn't. That wasn't his ideal division. He hadn't had his technical turnaround yet. He hadn't developed his boxing game, his defense to the level that we saw later. Like, that's just not Prime Poirier. Granted, the two wins against McGregor that Poirier has are also not against Prime McGregor. They're against prime McGregor, because that's after McGregor had the layoffs. That's after he became, you know, a drunkard whose life was descending into this saga of criminal debauchery. So fair enough. Neither of them, they both have victories over each other, but neither of them have victories over prime versions of each other. And if we were to ask, you know, what happens if you take the McGregor that fought Alvarez and put him in against the Poirier that fought, you know, Holloway, what would happen? I'm not sure. I'm not sure who I'd pick. I could see it going either way. But in general, more often than not, I'm picking Poirier to be the champ in these older eras. Like, I simply am. Now, here's another way in which it gets tricky, though, and where, you know, to be even-handed, we have to, you know, if we pull out a fine-tooth comb and really look at Poirier's wins, it gets a little weird, because, like, look at his win streak after the Johnson loss. You know, he's got Jim Miller, he's got Pettis, he's got Gaethje, he's got Alvarez, he's got Holloway, he's got Hooker, he's got Chandler, he's got McGregor twice, he's got Benoit Saint-Denis. I think that's everybody. Now, you can poke holes in a lot of those. Like, you can say, well, Miller was kind of old, Pettis was kind of old, Alvarez was kind of old, Gaethje was before his technical turnaround. That was when he was still just a brawler. That was before he realized he needed to actually pace himself, really work on his footwork, really work on his counters, work on his feints, like. And they had a rematch, and granted, Poirier is the older of the two, so he was maybe a little more past it than Gaethje was in the rematch, so you can try to write it off for that reason. But in the rematch, that was the technical version of Justin Gaethje, and Gaethje knocked him out. So, you know, does that diminish what you think of his first victory, and does that affect how you look at Poirier versus Gaethje in terms of who's the better lightweight? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The Holloway fight, that's prime Holloway, but you could argue that he hadn't acclimated to lightweight. You know, that was a short jump up to lightweight. He was pudgy, you know, and it was still a close fight. Hooker win is solid, but Hooker is not one of the top dudes. Chandler was past his prime, and, you know, I hate the way people dog on Chandler, because, like, Chandler was past his prime when he came to the UFC. The Hooker win is a past prime Chandler knocking out Dan Hooker. If you followed, as Smith can, you know, Smith, if you're seeing this, like, you'll understand, like, if you followed Michael Chandler's career in Bellator, you watched him age out of his prime. And when it got announced that he was coming to the UFC, it was kind of like when Pitbull did, where it's like, oh, that's awesome, I want to see it, but I wish it could have happened a few years earlier when he still had some years left in his prime, you know? And so that was a past prime Chandler that Poirier defeated. It was a past prime McGregor, like we discussed. And Benoit Saint-Denis, you could say, you know, he was so young that it's pre-prime, but also it's simply the fact that that win has aged badly, because that guy's just gone on to lose a bunch since. So literally every win, kind of from his technical turnaround onward, we've been able to poke a hole in. Now, how big of holes those are, you know, if you're going to be that thorough when looking at people's wins, you're going to find holes like that in virtually everyone's resume. So overall, I don't think you can dog on Poirier too much. I think you mostly just look at the name value of those guys, and, you know, and you see an amazing resume. However, where you also got to criticize Poirier is the fact that he did not just lose to the all-time greats. Because it'd be one thing if he just lost to Khabib, Oliveira, and Islam. Because then you could say, well, that's kind of like Daniel Cormier only losing to Jones and Stipe, Jones being the best light heavyweight ever, Stipe being at least the best UFC heavyweight ever. You know, that's not a bad look per se. However, Poirier didn't just lose to those guys, because he, of course, has the losses at featherweight, which I, more than Smith, am willing to kind of write off as pre-prime Poirier, not in his right division. I'm not going to, like, they still happened, but I'm not going to get too fixated on the fact he lost to Korean Zombie, he lost to McGregor. I don't care that much. But at lightweight, he didn't just lose to Khabib, Oliveira, and Islam. He also lost to Michael Johnson and to Gaethje. And we discussed the Gaethje one, but, like, the Michael Johnson one is tricky because a lot of people would say it's actually after that fight that he really turns around, that his boxing and his defense really comes, you know, to fruition for Poirier. But he was starting to turn around leading up to that, because he had that good win streak that he was going in with, and it still just happened. You know, yeah. I mean, so it's like you can say like, well, that wasn't the absolute best version of me, but you still knocked me out in a round. You know, and sure, Michael Johnson is a tricky character. He somehow beats the best guys. He beats Poirier. He beats Ferguson. He beats Barboza. You know, he's got great wins, but then he'll lose to scrubs. So he's just a kind of chaotic variable to have on your resume. But, you know, and so while you can sort of make excuses for that loss, and while you can make excuses for the Gaethje loss, I think it's giving Poirier too much benefit of the doubt to just write those both off and pretend he only lost to great champions. Because he lost to 3 great champions, and he lost to those guys. So, so where does that all, what's the ultimate conclusion then? I think the conclusion is still that Poirier is a great lightweight. He's one of the greats. He's probably somewhere in that like top 5, top 6 kind of range, I think. I think he ultimately is a better lightweight than an Eddie Alvarez, than a Michael Chandler, than a Justin Gaethje, you know? And while he didn't win the belt, I still think he had a stronger strength of schedule, had better wins, and simply would have likely beaten people like Anthony Pettis, people like Benson Henderson, you know, people like RDA. So, you know, where that all, you know, exactly where you want to rank him, you know, I don't care. But the idea that Poirier never became a legend, the idea that Poirier is just a fan favorite action fighter who, you know, never reached the top and can't be considered one of the greats, I just firmly disagree with. And, you know, I think I get it. You know, I'm reminded of when Chael Sonnen retired and Luke Thomas said he wasn't an all-time great middleweight, and Chael made the response video and it turned into a whole thing. Like, I get it. I get where there's popular fighters who we love and whom we can kind of overrate, and Smith brings up the UFC Hall of Fame and how it's kind of become a thing where they'll just put in fan favorites. Like if it's a true Hall of Fame, like Michael Bisping should not be in it. And Bisping is one of my favorite fighters. I was so happy when he won the belt. But if it's truly like supposed to be reserved for like the greatest fighters ever, like he doesn't fucking belong there. And yeah, Poirier, you know, probably shouldn't be in there either, but only a few people should. And to me, that's just like no one's saying Poirier is one of the top couple lightweights, but we are saying he's one of the best lightweights ever in a more forgiving sense, in a more like top 5, top 10 kind of sense. And I think at that level, Poirier is definitely there. And I think the fact that we can list 10 people who are champions doesn't mean that they should all push Poirier out of that kind of ranking.